The morning Adaeze got fired, the temperature in Atlanta was 41 degrees, and she had left her coat on the bus. She stood in the parking lot of Northbrook Academy in her thin cardigan, the kind with the pulled thread at the left elbow she kept meaning to fix, and she held the termination letter with both hands because one hand wasn't steady enough to hold it alone. Her breath came out in small white clouds. She didn't go back inside. She just stood there, reading the same paragraph over and over, conduct unbecoming of a Northbrook faculty member, until the words stopped making sense. She had been a teacher for 6 years. She had never once been late. Let me take you back to where this really started, because the parking lot is not the beginning. The beginning was 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday evening in October, when Adaeze was sitting at her kitchen table, grading vocabulary quizzes, and her phone rang. She almost didn't answer it. She had been on her feet since 6 in the morning. She had eaten half a granola bar at lunch because Marcus Osei had knocked over her coffee at the same time the fire drill went off, and there hadn't been a quiet moment after that. She was 31 years old, and she moved through her days like someone carrying a bowl of water, carefully, always watching the surface, always afraid of what would spill. Her name was Adaeze Okonkwo. She went by Miss Oko to her students, partly because Okonkwo made the front office staff visibly nervous every time they had to say it at faculty meetings, and partly because Ms. Oko sounded warm in a way that made 8-year-olds trust you faster. She had come to the United States from Enugu at age 9, raised by her mother, in a 2-bedroom apartment in Decatur, the kind of apartment where the radiator banged all winter, and the landlord's number went to voicemail. Her mother cleaned offices at night. Adaeze grew up doing her homework by the light of the kitchen stove, because the lamp in the living room flickered, and her mother didn't want to waste the bulb. She had put herself through college on grants and a part-time job at a dry cleaner on Memorial Drive. She had gotten her teaching certification the same month her mother was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. She had chosen Northbrook Academy not because it paid well. It didn't, but because it was in the kind of neighborhood where she had grown up, and she believed, maybe naively, that it mattered whether the person at the front of a classroom looked like the children sitting in it. She answered the phone. It was the mother of one of her students, Fatima Mensa, 8 years old, second row from the window, the one who drew little stars in the margins of every paper she turned in. Fatima's mother, Amma, was crying so hard Adaeze could barely understand her. The words came in pieces. The test, the fee, the deadline was today. I didn't know. I thought the school covered it. I didn't know. The Georgia Regional Academic Assessment. $47 per student for the external testing fee. It was due by the end of business that day. Northbrook's policy was clear. Students without paid fees could not sit for the exam, and the exam results went into the student's permanent academic file. Missed it once, you could appeal. Missed it twice, and certain scholarship programs would not consider you. Fatima was already on the list for a gifted program evaluation. This exam was the first step. $47. Adaeze looked at her bank app. She had $212 until the 15th. Her car insurance was due on the 12th. She looked at Fatima's quiz on the table in front of her. Ambiguous, reluctant, persevere, and Fatima had gotten all 3 right and drawn a tiny star next to number 7 for no reason at all. She paid the fee online before she could think about it too hard. She submitted it through the parent portal under a note that said, "Anonymous donor," because she didn't want Amma to feel ashamed, and she didn't want Fatima to feel like a charity case, and she went back to her grading with the particular quiet of someone who has done a small thing and knows it will cost them. She told no one. That's the part that matters. She did not post about it. She did not mention it in the faculty lounge. She did not even tell her closest friend on staff, a science teacher named Priya, who would have immediately tried to pay her back and made it into a whole conversation. Adaeze just filed it away in the part of her memory where she kept things that felt right, but didn't need an audience. The test happened 2 weeks later. Fatima sat in the third row of the exam room and chewed on her pencil eraser and got the second highest score in the second grade. What Adaeze did not know was that the parent portal flagged anonymous payments for review. The school's business manager, a precise woman named Sandra Briggs, who had been at Northbrook for 19 years and treated the budget with the seriousness of a sacred text, had a standing alert set for any transaction that didn't match a registered parent account. Sandra brought the flagged record to the principal. The principal was a man named Charles Whitfield. He was 54 years old, the kind of man who wore his credentials like body armor. Framed on the wall, listed in his email signature, mentioned in the first 5 minutes of every parent meeting. He had taken over Northbrook 3 years ago from a principal who had been beloved, and he had spent those 3 years replacing warmth with metrics. Test scores were up. Staff morale was not something he tracked. Whitfield called Adaeze into his office on a Monday morning before homeroom. She sat across from him at the clean glass desk, and he folded his hands and looked at her the way you look at a problem you've been meaning to resolve. Mims. Okonkwo, he said. He always said the full name. She had noticed, "Are you a school as a sapali regarding unauthorized financial transactions on behalf of enrolled students?" She said she was. "And are you aware that circumventing the official fee waiver process, even with good intentions, creates a liability issue for this institution?" She said she understood. "Then I need you to explain to me why you went around the system." Adaeze looked at him. Outside the window behind his head, the oak tree in the courtyard was finally dropping its leaves, late, the way Atlanta trees always seemed surprised by autumn. She had been looking at that tree from her classroom window for 6 years. "Because Fatima didn't have $47, Adaeze said, and the deadline was that day. And the waiver process takes 10 business days." Whitfield tapped his pen against the desk once. "The process exists for a reason. The process would have gotten her an answer after the test was already over." He looked at her for a long moment. "This isn't the first time you've operated outside of established channels, Ms. Okonkwo. Last spring, you let 3 students use school supplies from your own classroom to complete projects after the materials budget was frozen. In February, you stayed 2 hours past contract time every Thursday to run an unofficial tutoring session that was never approved by the administration. Those students were failing. That's not the point." There it was, that sentence, sitting between them like a wall. That's not the point. She had heard some version of it her whole life, not from teachers who cared about her, from institutions that didn't. "I'm going to need to put a formal letter of concern in your file," Whitfield said. "This is your second documented incident this year. If there is a third, I will be recommending non-renewal of your contract." Adaeze nodded. She went back to her classroom. She taught 3 periods back-to-back without sitting down once, and when her kids were at specials, she sat at her desk and graded papers and did not let herself think about the letter in her file or the insurance payment due on the 12th. The third incident happened on a Friday. It was not dramatic. It did not feel, in the moment, like the kind of thing that changes a life. It felt like a Tuesday, except it was a Friday, and the thing that happened was this. A child fell on the playground during recess and cut his knee badly on the corner of the concrete retaining wall, and the school nurse was out sick, and the substitute nurse was on the phone when it happened. And the child, a kindergartner named Theo, small and gap-toothed and prone to crying without sound before the actual crying started, was sitting on the ground, looking at his knee the way children look at something that hasn't started hurting yet, but will. Adaeze was the closest adult. She did what she always did. She crouched down next to him. She talked to him in the low, calm voice she used for scared children and frightened animals and adults who were about to cry in the grocery store parking lot. And she cleaned the cut with the first aid kit from the outdoor equipment shed. And she walked him inside and sat with him until his mother came. Theo's mother arrived 22 minutes later. She was a small woman with a tight jaw who worked in pharmaceutical sales and ran the booster club, and had, Adaeze would learn later, been quietly unhappy with the school for reasons that had nothing to do with Adaeze and everything to do with a dispute with Whitfield over the fall fundraiser allocation. She looked at her son's bandaged knee. She looked at Adaeze. She asked, with precision, why a second-grade teacher had administered first aid without waiting for the nurse on duty. By Monday morning, Whitfield had the complaint on his desk. This is the part that should make you angry, and I want you to sit with it for a second before I continue, because what happened next is the kind of thing that happens every day in every city in this country, in quiet offices with clean glass desks, and nobody rings a bell or sounds an alarm. Whitfield called Adaeze in. He slid the termination letter across the desk. He walked her through the language. Unauthorized administration of medical care, repeated pattern of operating outside established protocols, liability to the institution, and he did it in the measured tone of a man who has convinced himself that following the rules is the same thing as being right. She asked if there was an appeal process. He said there was, and that the timeline was 60 days, and that she should contact the teachers' union. She said she would. She gathered her things from her classroom over the next 2 hours. Her students were in art when she cleaned out her desk, which she was grateful for, because she didn't want them to see her face doing what it was doing. She put her grade book, her spare cardigan, the little pot of air plant that had survived every radiator and heating vent in the building for 3 years, and the string of pictures her students had drawn for her birthday in February, all of it into a cardboard box. She walked out through the side entrance. That's where we came in. The parking lot, the 41 degrees, the thin cardigan. She drove home. She sat in her car in front of her apartment for a while, because going inside felt like making it real. Then she went inside and called her mother. Her mother, Grace, said, "Come home," she said. "Mama, I am home." "Then come here. Come here and eat something, and tell me everything." She drove to Decatur. She ate jollof rice at her mother's kitchen table for the first time in 2 months, and Grace sat across from her and listened. And when Adaeze was done talking, Grace was quiet for a long moment. "You did right," Grace said. "You hear me? You did exactly right. I lost my job, Mama." "You did right," Grace said again, firmly, like a door closing. "The rest is not yours to carry." Adaeze drove home at 9 o'clock. She sent an email to the teachers' union. She made a list of expenses and circled the ones that were flexible. She applied for 2 tutoring positions online. She fell asleep before midnight, which surprised her because she had expected to lie awake for hours. What she did not know was that 22 miles away, in a hotel suite downtown, a man was reading an email. His name was Kwame Asante. He was 63 years old, originally from Kumasi, Ghana, and he had built 3 companies across 20 years. One in logistics, one in educational technology, and one in commercial real estate, and he had sold 2 of them and still ran the 3rd. He was not famous in the way that people who appear on magazine covers are famous. He was known in rooms that most people never enter. He wore the same style of watch he had worn since his 30s, a simple steel thing because his mother had told him once that a man who needs to show you his wealth is not secure in it. He was in Atlanta because his foundation, the Adaeze Education Trust, was in the middle of its annual site visit process. The trust funded literacy programs and academic support services at 15 schools across the Southeast, and every year Kwame came personally to at least 3 of the schools on the roster. Northbrook Academy had been receiving a $40,000 annual grant from the trust for 4 years. The renewal was due in December. What most people at Northbrook did not know, because the trust operated quietly, and Whitfield had signed the grant agreement with a third-party administrator, was that the site visits were not announced. Kwame showed up as something else. Last year at a school in Charlotte, he had come as a facilities assessor. The year before in Memphis, he had come as a volunteer reading tutor through a partner organization. At Northbrook for the past 3 weeks, he had come as a parent volunteer. Twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday mornings, a man named Mr. K, quiet, silver-haired, wore a Northbrook volunteer badge and always brought his own coffee, had been sitting in the back of classrooms, helping students during independent reading, fixing a broken bookshelf in the hallway, doing the kinds of small, invisible tasks that schools always need done and never have enough hands for. He had been in Adaeze's classroom 4 times. He had watched her teach fractions to 8-year-olds, using examples about sharing food and splitting taxi fares, and 3 of those 8-year-olds had gotten it in a way they hadn't before. He had watched her notice, without being told, that a boy in the back corner was having a hard day, and redirect the whole group activity to give him something he could succeed at. He had watched her stay after the other students left to sit with a girl who was reading below grade level and wanted to give up, and talk to her for 12 minutes about every hard thing the girl could already do. He had been watching the school too. The things Whitfield prioritized. The way the staff talked about the budget in the hallways. The gap between the mission statement on the website and the decisions made in the main office. When the email arrived, from a parent on the school board who knew of his foundation's connection to Northbrook and wanted him to know what had happened to a teacher named Adaeze Okonkwo, he read it twice. Then he called his assistant. "Get me Charles Whitfield's calendar and get the foundation's legal team on the phone." What happened next took 10 days. The teachers' union filed Adaeze's appeal. The Adaeze Education Trust sent a letter to Northbrook's board of directors informing them that the annual grant renewal was under review pending the outcome of an institutional conduct assessment. Language that the board's attorney translated, quickly and correctly, as "this is serious." A local education journalist, one who had been covering school funding issues for 6 years, and whose calls Whitfield's assistant usually intercepted, received an anonymous tip about a teacher who had been terminated after paying for a student's testing fee out of her own pocket. The story ran on a Wednesday. It was not a big story. Not at first, a small piece on the education beat, buried in the Metro section, the kind of article that usually gets 12 shares. But the comments filled up. Then a parent from another district shared it. Then a teachers group shared it. By Friday, it had been read 40,000 times, and a woman in Rhode Island had started a fundraiser for Adaeze that nobody asked her to start. And by the following Tuesday, it had raised $9,000, and a retired principal in Ohio had sent a personal letter to Northbrook's board. Adaeze found out about the fundraiser the same way she found out about most things that week, through her phone, which had started ringing in ways it never had before, and did not stop. She sat in her apartment with the air plant on the kitchen table and her mother's voice on speakerphone and watched the notifications come in, and felt, for the first time since the parking lot, something other than the specific cold of a 41-degree morning. She didn't know yet about Kwame. She didn't know about the foundation review or the board meeting that had been called for that Thursday. She didn't know that Whitfield had been asked, in writing, to provide documentation justifying each of the 3 incidents cited in her termination letter, and that the documentation for the first 2 did not exist in the form he claimed. She knew that she had paid $47 for a child's exam fee. She knew she had cleaned a child's cut knee. She knew she had stayed late on Thursdays to help kids who were failing, because nobody else was staying late, and she could. The board voted on a Thursday evening. Adaeze was not in the room. She was at her mother's house, eating rice again, when her union representative called. "They're reinstating you," the rep said. "Full back pay for the period of termination. Letter of concern removed from your file. Whitfield has been placed on administrative review, pending a broader audit of personnel decisions over the last 2 years." Adaeze held the phone. "Mrs. Okonkwo? Are you still there?" "Yes," she said. "I'm here." Her mother was looking at her from across the table. Grace Okonkwo had cleaned office buildings at night for 11 years, so that her daughter could do her homework under a kitchen light. She had a way of reading her daughter's face the way some people read weather. "Good news?" Grace asked. Adaeze set the phone down on the table. She looked at her mother. She thought about the parking lot, and the cold, and the pulled thread on her cardigan, and the cardboard box with the air plant in it, and Fatima's vocabulary quiz with the star drawn next to number 7. "Yes, Mama," she said. "Good news." She went back to Northbrook on a Monday. Her classroom was exactly as she had left it. The desks in their rows, the alphabet strip above the whiteboard, the world map with the push pins where her students had marked every country a family member had ever come from. There were 31 pins. Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Guatemala, Vietnam, Haiti, the Philippines, Jamaica, Senegal, a cluster of 3 in the American South. She stood in the doorway for a moment before the students arrived. She had been gone 11 days. 11 days of policy language and board votes, and a fundraiser she hadn't asked for, and phone calls from journalists and strangers, and one very long email from a woman in South Carolina who had been a teacher for 30 years and wanted Adaeze to know she was not alone. She walked to her desk. She took the air plant out of her bag and put it back on the corner, where it always sat. She pulled out the grade book. She did not know yet that Kwame Asante had expanded the Asante Education Trust's grant to Northbrook from $40,000 to $120,000, contingent on a series of institutional reforms, teacher support programs, an expedited fee waiver process, and a formalized whistleblower protection policy. She did not know that part of that expansion included a named endowment for classroom innovation grants that teachers could apply for directly, without going through the principal's office. She would find out in a few weeks when the new board chair came to introduce herself and mentioned, almost as an aside, that the grant expansion had been requested specifically because of a teacher named Okonkwo. She would find out that a quiet man who drank his own coffee and fixed a broken bookshelf and sat in the back of her classroom 4 times watching her teach children how to think, that man had seen her. All of it. The staying late, the equity pencils she kept in her top drawer for kids who came without supplies, the way she talked to frightened children, the $47 she paid on a Tuesday night. Because she didn't know what else to do. He had seen her, and he had said so, in the way that people with real power sometimes say things. Not loudly, and not for an audience, but in a way that actually changes what happens next. But that morning, standing in the doorway of her classroom, Adaeze didn't know any of that yet. She just knew that the first bell was about to ring. She knew that in 4 minutes, 31 children would come through that door, some of them excited, and some of them tired, and at least 2 of them still confused about fractions. And they would all need something from her. Her attention, her patience, her willingness to stand at the front of a room and insist that every single one of them was capable of more than they believed. She straightened the desks in the first row. She wrote the date on the board. She uncapped the marker and stood there for a second, listening to the hallway start to fill. Then the bell rang, and Adaeze Okonkwo, who had paid $47 for a child she didn't have to save, who had cleaned a knee she didn't have to clean, who had stayed late every Thursday for children who needed her, and never once asked to be noticed for it. She turned to face the door, and she smiled, and she let them in. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you believe teachers like Adaeze deserve to be seen, hit that subscribe button, because we tell these stories every week. Leave a comment below. Would you have done what Adaeze did? Tell me honestly.